Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. This is Kirsten. If I could get everybody to raise their hand to let me know that you can hear me, I would appreciate it. Okay, so I see a couple of people have raised their hand, but a lot have not. So Carol, Francis, Pang, Tammy, if you can hear me, would you please raise your hand? If you're having trouble, please send me a message in the chat or question section. Billy, can you hear me? Alicia? Great. Tammy's having some problems. All right. We're going to get these computers. Oh, okay. Looks like computer does not have audio, Tammy. You will need audio in order to listen to today's session. All right, so a couple of people have recommended that headphones will work if the computer doesn't have audio. So you might want to plug headphones into your computer. Thank you, Sarah. That's a great bit of advice. Francis, if you look in the sidebar of your webinar, there will be a little hand, and if you click it, it's you raising your hand. All right, we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. I want to give everybody the opportunity to make sure they've got their audio figured out. We did have 33 people registered for the training today, and only 20 are on board so far. So we're going to give everybody a couple of seconds to get in. All right, it's 1:06, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started since the first little bit will just be us doing some basic housekeeping stuff. So you are in listen only mode today, and what that means is that you can hear me, but I cannot hear you and you cannot hear each other. So if you have a question, please type your question into the questions section of the sidebar. That will come directly to me and I will be able to answer the question. I will do my very best to answer all of the questions in a timely fashion. We do have plenty of time for the training today. I should be able to get to everyone's questions. If, however, your question happens to be super specific to a very personal issue that you have going that isn't going to be beneficial for the rest of the group, I will ask you to send me an email about that and we'll connect after this time. Today's training is being recorded, and with any luck, it will be placed on the Behavior Professionals webpage some point in the future, probably not right now due to COVID-19 taking up our IT department's time and energies, but at some point in the future, it will be there for you to be able to watch at any point in time. I will not be sharing the link to this until it's posted, nor will I be sharing the PDF of this training. This training is intended to go in conjunction with reading the rule and with the guide to professional behavior services. It is not intended to be a completely standalone training. If you would like a certification of completion at the very end of this training in about an hour, I will give you a website to go to. You'll simply type in the web address I give you into any web browser and answer a couple of very basic questions, and you will be sent a certification of this webinar, and it'll go straight to your email. So again, if you have any questions, just type them into the questions section. I'll be monitoring that as we go through and trying to answer them all in a timely fashion. Today we are talking about authorizing professional behavior services, also known in the past as behavior consultation. And this is a pretty in-depth training, but it is intended to go hand in hand with reading the rule and the guide to professional behavior services. The first thing I want to talk about is eligibility for the service. No one can authorize this service unless the individual is eligible. And a person is eligible by demonstrating the need for professional behavior services. Sometimes that need is demonstrated through the functional needs assessment, also called the ONA, the CIS, the SNAP, the CNA, or the ANA. Those are all functional needs assessments. And sometimes we identify the challenging behavior through discussion with the individual's ISP team. For an individual to be eligible to receive professional behavior services, the individual must exhibit a challenging behavior for which a functional alternative behavior can be developed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So the functional needs assessment sometimes captures and sometimes does not capture the challenging behavior. And so when the individual's team identifies a challenging behavior that the individual could benefit from professional behavior services, but perhaps it was not captured in the functional needs assessment, the team still can include this in the ISP, and that will fulfill the eligibility requirement for this service. So let's talk a little bit about a functional alternative behavior. When a functional alternative behavior does not, when the functional behavior assessment does not indicate the need for a functional alternative behavior, then a positive behavior support plan is not indicated. Now, it's very important for you to understand what a functional alternative behavior is. A functional alternative behavior is a behavior that serves the same purpose as the challenging behavior. And we can help the individual change their behavior to get their needs met. If we can't help the individual to change their behavior, but we can change the outcome by altering staff behavior or by changing the environment, then informal guidelines may be developed. Now, informal guidelines go by lots of different names. But basically what an informal guideline is it's telling the staff to do something different, or the natural supports to do something different, or it's directing an environmental change. Informal guidelines are not a component of professional behavior services, and they cannot be invoiced by a behavior professional. Informal guidelines may not include any intervention with restraining qualities. Now, a behavior professional might be called upon to develop these, but they can't be compensated for them. The functional behavior assessment that was started can be billed for and invoiced, even when a positive behavior support plan is not indicated. I'm going to pause here for a couple of seconds to see if there are any questions about functional alternative behaviors. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but if you have questions later, go ahead and type them in and we'll just come back to functional alternative behaviors. So let's talk a little bit about eligibility for individuals in a 24-hour or supported living setting. So individuals currently today, individuals who choose to reside in a 24-hour or supported living setting are really also choosing to receive their professional behavior services as part of that service package delivered by the residential agency. Therefore, a services coordinator does not need to separately authorize professional behavior services in the ISP or in Express. An individual may express a desire. They may say that they want to have a different behavior professional who's not an employee of the 24-hour residential or supported living agency. Individuals may choose in those cases from amongst any qualified or enrolled and endorsed provider. The individual must choose from the list of enrolled or endorsed providers if the individual chooses not to have the behavior professional deliver their services. And if they choose to do that, then that agency must be endorsed to deliver the service. They must be endorsed through OAR 411304. Any questions about that? Okay, not seeing any questions about that. Again, if you have questions, Carol is asking, behavior services must be authorized in kids res. That is correct, Carol. So this is it, adults residing in a 24-hour setting are in effect authorizing professional behavior services when they are choosing that 24-hour setting. Children's services have been unbundled, and therefore the children's guardian and team does have to separately authorize professional behavior services in both the ISP as well as Express. Good point of clarification, Carol. Thank you. Once professional behavior services are unbundled from the adults rate category or tier payment, then the adult has to receive choice counseling from the services coordinator, and they can choose from amongst all enrolled or endorsed providers of professional behavior services. Kids services have already been unbundled. It is the services coordinator's responsibility to clarify roles and responsibilities that the ISP team must agree upon, and these things should include training, retraining, reporting of incidents, and maintaining the positive behavior support plan. We want to make sure that there's a clear, identified, and documented agreement to understand how these types of things will be taking place. Currently, since adults who reside in 24-hour settings have their professional behavior services bundled into their package of services that is covered through the tier payment system, if they are receiving professional behavior services, that will be provided by the 24-hour agency for the home and community. So when an individual has an additional setting, such as employment, then we want to make sure we authorize that separately. We want to make sure that, I'm going to head back here for a second, eligibility for individuals in a 24-hour or report or residential or supported living setting. The services coordinator needs to document the roles and responsibilities in the ISP and or service agreement, whichever the team has opted to use. If an individual is enrolled in 24-hour or foster care, then the ISP team needs to agree that the challenging behavior exists and that there could be a benefit of including professional behavior services. And that needs to be both a chosen service in the ISP and also needs to be authorized and expressed. And we'll be going through those processes today. We want to be clear that we're authorizing not a general chunk of services, but specifically what is being authorized. Are we authorizing a temporary emergency safety plan? We will always be authorizing a functional behavior assessment. And if that functional behavior assessment indicates the need for a positive behavior support plan, that also needs to be authorized. We also want to identify, after the plan has been written and trained initially, if we're going to need to maintain that plan. And that will also need to be authorized both in the ISP as well as in Express. So I'm going to take a small little jaunt off the trail for a half a second and talk about the need for translation. Anytime an individual or the designated persons happen to speak a language other than that which is spoken by the behavior professional, the case manager, the services coordinator, or personal agent must identify that interpreter is needed. And then the services coordinator or personal agent must identify an interpretation vendor from the list of authorized vendors. And then the personal agent or services coordinator needs to complete a notice to proceed, and that needs to be done correctly, including identifying the behavior professional, because the behavior professional who has been identified in the ISP will be the person signing the notice to proceed, identifying that the translation services were provided. Then the personal agent or services coordinator will submit the notice to proceed to the interpretation vendor. The interpretation vendor will then coordinate with both the CME as well as the behavior professional to make sure that the dates and times needed for the service are going to work for everybody. Are there any questions about the use of translation and how to make that happen for professional behavior services? So once you've identified that a person is eligible for the service and that the service is going to be needed, you need to identify each portion of professional behavior services. Each portion gets identified by the services coordinator or personal agent, and identifying the reason why the individual could benefit from that portion of the service, as well as coordinating the number of hours requested by the ISP team, and then authorizing that in the chosen K plan services. We have received over the last couple of years so many problems identified that could have been solved if we clearly documented in the ISP which services were being needed and the amount of hours allotted to that portion of the service. We want to make sure that we identify and describe every single challenging behavior. So in the known risks section of the individual's ISP, the services coordinator or personal agent clearly articulates each known challenge, each known behavior being exhibited by the individual. Ideally, this will match the risk identification or the risk tracker. We don't want to have too many mismatches there. The more clearly this is documented, the more likely it is that the behavior professional will be able to create specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic plans for addressing the challenging behaviors with a functional alternative behavior plan. Now, sometimes once a behavior professional gets started, the designated persons or mom, the PSW, the DSP will identify, oh, hey, and there's also these challenging behaviors that have come up. It is up to the team to make sure that all of the documents get updated. It is not the responsibility of the behavior professional to update the known risks section of the ISP. It is not the behavior professional's responsibility to update the risk, the RIT, and it's not the behavior professional's responsibility to make sure that all this paperwork coordinates. It is the behavior professional's responsibility to maintain open and appropriate communication when they realize that there are other known challenging behaviors that hadn't been previously identified. It's really important to identify if the challenging behavior is a high risk. Once the challenging behavior has been identified and documented in the ISP team, you can click here for this risk assessment matrix. I'm gonna just go ahead and take us over there for a second. This is on our resource page and available to everyone to use. So this risk assessment can be used by the entire team, by the team of designated persons, maybe just mom and the behavior professional, to really clearly identify the risk assessment, to identify whether it's a minimal or a very high risk. Just want to give you a second to maybe screenshot where you will find this risk assessment. Okay. So in the chosen services section of the ISP, the services coordinator or personal agent can use the drop-down boxes to describe the correct and appropriate service for the individual. In some cases, the services coordinator or personal agent may have to type in specific information if it's not included in that drop-down list. So one of the service codes is code OR570. Now, this is what a services coordinator or personal agent will select if they need to authorize a temporary emergency safety plan, a functional behavior assessment, or when the functional behavior assessment indicates the need for a positive behavior support plan. The ISP describes this code as behavior consultation assessment and training for DD. So it's the same thing as a TESP, FBA, or PBSP. The language has yet to be updated. It also matches the explanation of the codes in Express. And remember that the total number of combined hours authorized for the TESP, FBA, and PBSP can't exceed 30 without a written exception from ODDS. And it's up to the ISP team to identify how to allot those 30 hours. Some people might need 10 for the TESP, 10 for the FBA, and 10 for the PBSP. Other people may not need a TESP at all, and they're going to allot 15 for the temporary emergency safety plan and 15 to develop the positive behavior support plan. Other people may have a lengthy history, and we know that we need more than 15 hours to develop the functional behavior assessment. It is up to the ISP team to decide how to allot those things and to clearly document them. Also, make sure that you're always checking the most updated expenditure guidelines so that you can stay in touch with the changes. Once you have identified all of this information in the ISP, you want to make sure that you're choosing the correct code. After selecting the code, you want to identify the number of units for that service. And for professional behavior services, the number of units needs to be based on the individual's needs, and it needs to align with the discussion by the ISP team. There are 3 units for code 570. These 3 units are the TESP, the FBA, and the PBSP. You cannot allot more than 3 units. If you do, you will end up with billing errors. The sum of the hours of these 3 units can't exceed 30, but there are really only 3 units. Remember that this is an outcome-based service, and the outcome is the TESP, the FBA, and the PBSP. The unit type for OR code 570 is event, because this is an event-based service. And then we are going to document when we complete the event, when you complete the document, then that's when that portion of professional behavior services has been completed. You also want to make sure that the frequency for code OR 570 is per plan year, because the individual may be eligible to receive a TESP, FBA, and PBSP once per plan year without exception granted through ODDS. Is this always necessary? No. But is it available? Yes. So I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions about this so far. Okay, moving on. You also want to make sure that you're clearly authorizing the dates and that those should be in accordance with the ISP team agreement, but they can't exceed the plan year. So you want to clarify for each portion of professional behavior services, what is the expected completion date? So we're going to say, and I'm going to use simple math, we're going to pretend that Susie needs professional behavior services. We're going to allot 10 hours for the TESP, 10 hours for the FBA, and 10 hours for the PBSP. So we've identified the hours. We're also going to clarify the dates of completion, the expected dates of completion. So let's say we're going to allot 10 hours for the TESP, and by rule, they're only allowed to have, that must be completed within 15 days. So we would identify in the ISP however many 15 days is away. Then let's say we allot 10 hours to develop the FBA, and we're going to say, I don't know, 90 days. There is no rule requirement, but we do want to make an agreement. And then for the PBSP, we're going to allot the final 10 hours for the development of the PBSP, assuming that it is indicated in the functional behavior assessment. And we're going to allot an additional 90 days for that to be completed. Again, the TESP has rule requirements about how long the TESP must be, how quickly it must be completed, but there is no rule requirement for the FBA or PBSP. The next portion of the ISP asks the services coordinator or personnel agent to list the chosen provider. This is simply the qualified and enrolled behavior professional or the name of the endorsed agency. If it's an agency, the agency may have a number of behavior professionals working on the plan, and that's okay. You're going to identify the name of the agency. So let's say Susie Q, the individual, chooses to have Kirsten's pretty good behavior professional agency, and Kirsten has 5 employees. You don't need to list all 5 employees. You simply need to list Kirsten's pretty good behavior agency. You're then going to identify the rates. This is important to get clear. For code OR 570, unlike with other service elements, specific rates are not indicated in the ISP. So a services coordinator and personal agent isn't going to list a dollar amount. The services coordinator or personal agent, preferably in conjunction with the behavior professional who will be serving the individual, should indicate the number of hours expected to be needed to complete each event as authorized. Each event, remember there are 3 events, as authorized by the ISP team and in the ISP. Additional information can be found in the expenditure guidelines if you are unclear about this, and it's also more clearly identified in the Guide to Professional Behavior Services. You're then going to clarify services. So in the chosen provider section of the individual's support plan, the ISP, the services coordinator or personal agent will list the needs identified by the functional needs assessment that the service will address. So remember, the functional needs assessment are the SIS, the SNAP, the CNA, the ONA, and the ANA. If the FNA doesn't have to capture the need for a behavior professional, but they are authorized in the ISP by the ISP team, this section is doubly important to provide clarity. The services coordinator or personal agent needs to clarify not only which behavior services are being authorized, but also make sure that you identify the challenging behavior. If the TESP is being needed, if a temporary emergency safety plan is needed, then the case manager needs to indicate the reason for the temporary emergency safety plan and the number of hours authorized for its completion. Remember, you have 30-hour bucket to work in, so figure out how to allot those hours and budget them appropriately. If a functional behavior assessment is necessary, then make sure that the services coordinator or personal agent indicates the challenging behaviors requiring the functional behavior assessment, identify the number of hours authorized for its completion, and remember, you have a 30-hour bucket to work in, so budget appropriately. And then remember about the functional behavior assessment needing to identify a functional alternative behavior. If there's nothing that the individual can do to learn to change their behavior, a positive behavior support plan is not indicated. At this point in time, the case manager would pay for the functional behavior assessment, but not authorize a positive behavior support plan. It's also very important that when you're authorizing the service, that the case manager document the individual's preference on how a behavior professional services are going to be delivered. It is important to talk about what's important to the individual. It's very important to talk about what's important for the individual. But that's not what we're getting at here. We are expecting that the preference for the delivery of service be documented. Talk to them about language preferences. Maybe there's some physical attributes, or like, I would really like to work with a guy. I don't get along with girls. I'd like to work with a guy. Maybe there are some other details that are very important to the individual. How do they want their services delivered to them? That's what we're looking for here. If maintenance of the plan is needed, there's a different code. If we need to maintain the positive behavior support plan, then we're using code OR310. And this needs to be selected, and it comes up as behavior support services. Again, this matches Express. It's just older language that has yet to be updated. Hang on, we've got a question. Let me read the question. So Cassie asks, recently at one of their licensing on-sites, they were informed that if a TESP is not needed before a functional behavior assessment, that needs to be clearly stated as noted. So no, if a temporary emergency safety plan is not needed, there's no reason why you have to document that. There's no rule requirement that if a temporary emergency safety plan is not needed, that needs to be documented. Mike, I'm going to unmute you a second so that you can address this. Hold on, Mike. I haven't been able to unmute you yet. Okay, Mike, can we hear you?
Can you?
Yes, I can. Okay, I'm going to mute myself. Can you talk about this?
Well, I mean, there's not much to say. It sounds like maybe someone in licensing has a misunderstanding about the requirements, because if that's not in the behavior rule, it doesn't exist in any other rule. So we can check in with licensing and make sure that they understand what they should be looking for.
Okay, great, thanks. Anytime something shows up on your plan of correction that doesn't have a rule citation, I strongly urge you to talk with your licensor and get that rule citation. What they have to cite the actual rule that you're violating or that they're holding you to. All right, you're welcome, Cassie. Okay. So remember that if you're authorizing maintenance of the plan, you're going to use code OR 310. And this time you're going to authorize the units or the number of hours. So prior, the units were the deliverables, the FBA, TESP, or PBSP. But in this case, if you're authorizing 310, the units are the number of hours you are authorizing. Now you can't go over 18 without an exception. So the number of units you would authorize are 18. You also want to indicate the need in the ISP. What is the need for maintaining the plan? This is essential to being able to match the invoices. You have to identify why are we maintaining this plan, because then when the invoices come in, you can match them. Remember, you have 18 hours per plan year. And when you get close to using those 18, you just need to ask for an exception. Over the last 2 years, what we've identified is that about 90% of the individual's needs for maintaining the plan can be met within those 18 hours. In a 24-hour setting for children, we're finding that that's not always the case. And so we're turning exceptions around within 1 week of receiving a correct exception and invoices. We're able to get the answer back out there within 1 week. And we're keeping very clear data to identify if we in the future need to adjust the hours of maintenance necessary for individuals who are in a 24-hour setting. So the unit type, the frequency, and the authorized dates for OR code 310 should be based on the needs of the individual and clearly, very clearly documented in the preferences section of the ISP. So oftentimes I hear from people saying, well, we get 3 hours a month. That's what the case manager approves. That's not a rule requirement. We're looking for the ISP team to band together and in conjunction with the behavior professional, identify clearly what does the individual need to maintain that plan. We also want to make sure that we're identifying and documenting how does the individual want their plan maintained. This is essential to knowing how to best serve an individual. Again, some questions to think about. Is there a specialization needed? So maybe the functional behavior assessment indicated a positive behavior support plan, and that positive behavior support plan indicated the need for working with someone who understands ADHD. Maybe we need somebody different to maintain the plan. That's important. We also want to identify language. Back to that translation we talked about with the notice to proceed being the responsibility of the case management entity. And maybe there are physical attributes or other details that the individual has expressed as really important to receiving their services. Once the behavior professional has been authorized to deliver the service, it is up to the case management entity to make sure that they include that behavior professional, either an independent provider or an agency provider, on their provider panel, and Express has created a help page for this. And the Express, for those of you who are not familiar, the information that Express puts out is very, very clear, including screenshots and exactly how to add a provider to your panel. So I'm going to pause here for a second. So for anybody who's unfamiliar with this, they can screenshot this web page. So making sure that things are authorized in Express is a key to making sure that billing goes smoothly and happens in a timely manner. So for all individuals who are currently enrolled in in-home or foster care, and for kids who are enrolled in 24-hour services, the services coordinator or personal agent, if it's an in-home setting, must authorize professional behavior services or the maintenance of the PBSP in Express prior to the service beginning. Behavior professionals, for those couple of you who are on this call, most of everybody who's on at the training today is a case manager, but there are a couple behavior professionals on here. Please, please, please check Express and make sure that authorization is in place before you start services. If the authorization is not in place before you start services, you run the risk of having a longer period of time for payment. And by the way, never start providing services without a signed ISP or service agreement. Because if you start working if services begin before the plan of care is fixed, before you have a signed ISP or signed ISP or a signed service agreement, you may not be reimbursed for the work that you've completed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about language, because this is part of the upcoming changes. And by upcoming, folks, with the virus and the changes that have to happen, I don't know how far this has been pushed back. So Express labels code OR 570 as, and they call it, Behavior Consultation, Assessment, and Training for DD. Really what it is professional behavior services. It's the TESP, the FBA, and the PBSP. And Express labels code 310 as behavior support services, but we all know that what that really means is maintenance of the positive behavior support plan. The plan line for professional behavior services is really important. So the services coordinator or personal agent must open a plan line in plan of care. And that plan line must identify the number of events needed. So you can go back into Express later and edit this if necessary. It would be, and I don't know why it says 87, that's a typo. It would be anticipated that a TESP and an FBA could be authorized simultaneously. That's okay. However, the PBSP can't be authorized, can't be completed until after the functional behavior assessment has been reviewed and approved, because the only time we know we need a PBSP is when it's indicated in an FBA. So let's talk a little bit about SPAs, or the service prior authorization. They need to include these three things in order to be appropriate. You must identify the behavior professional or the agency chosen by the individual to deliver that event. Sometimes you may have one behavior professional or one agency who can get in there and do that TESP immediately, but they're not able to do the FBA. That's fine. You can authorize different behavior professionals or different agencies to do different events. You also need to identify the date range expected for the completion of that event and the not to exceed dollar amount anticipated for the completion of that event. And to make life easier on you, it's totally okay for the case manager to go in, enter the TESP, FBA, and PBSP, enter those SPAs, but keep them in draft until you're actually ready to approve and submit them and move on to the next portion of the service. So you want to assure that the plan meets rule. And so now you've gone through, you've approved it, the behavior professional has gone out and delivered the service, and they've returned to you the device, the document. They've returned to you the TESP, the FBA, or the PBSP. It is the case manager's responsibility to read that plan. You're the one who knows the individual. You're the one who knows the setting, the designated persons. You must read that plan and make sure that it's going to meet the individual's needs and that it meets the requirements outlined in rule. So to make this a little easier on everyone, the Guide to Professional Behavior Services includes a checklist so that as you're reading the plan, you can literally go through and check off when you find each of the required elements in each of the required documents. The services coordinator or personal agent must not release payment, even if it's pending. You can't release that final payment until the document meets rule. Okay, we have a question here. Let me answer that question before we move forward. Okay, so the question is about a previous topic. So Cassie, why don't you send me an email since this is specific to you? Send me an email and we will help you work through that. If the document doesn't meet rule or doesn't meet the individual's needs, then the case manager must connect with the behavior professional and explain what's not compliant. The great part about that is if you've used your checklist as you've read your document, all you need to do is scan that checklist in and email it to the behavior professional and say these things are missing or are not clear. If the case manager reviews the document and the document doesn't meet rule, please, and you're having problems, please reach out. I am here to help and I can kind of play referee and help get things resolved. The services coordinator or the personal agent is expected to collaborate with the behavior professional during this process. You can't simply say it doesn't meet rule. We do expect that you provide them back with that checklist or some feedback of some sort so that we can all work together. And if you find that it meets rule, but it doesn't meet the individual's need, that's another time to collaborate with the behavior professional. And like I said, I'm the subject matter expert here. I'm here to help. Okay. Remember that professional behavior services is an event-based service. So the behavior professional who's completing the TESP, FBA, or PBSP, if it doesn't meet the minimum requirements outlined, they can't get paid for that. Behavior professionals, for the few of you who are on today, if you believe that your document does meet rule, but the case manager is not clearly explaining why they're not releasing the payment, please check in with me so that we can work it out together. Sometimes a behavior professional works with a family and in good faith, for some reason, they're just not able to actually complete the event. In these cases, a case management entity cannot release payment without an exception because the only time a case management can release payment is when the completed document meets rule. Well, sometimes the behavior professional can't complete the document. In those cases, just reach out through the exceptions process and explain why the event is incomplete. And we can get that turned around within about a week. It is important that the ISP team, in conjunction with the behavior professional, really plan for meeting those service limits. For code OR 570, the service limit is 30 hours. Remember that that's the TESP, FBA, and PBSP. In about 95% of the cases, an individual's TESP, FBA, and PBSP can be developed, including the initial training of the PBSP, within those 30 hours. But that means about 5 to 10% of the individuals we serve can't have their needs met within those 30 hours, can't have all of that completed. In those cases, the case manager, the services coordinator, or personal agent should just complete an exceptions process, go through the exceptions process. We have about a 1 week turnaround to allow for additional hours. It is essential that when requesting an exception to exceed the 30 hours, that the completed and approved documents be submitted, and we also need the corresponding invoice because we want to see where those hours were used. That's really, really important and often causes a delay in getting the exception approved or denied, because I can't approve or deny the exception if I do not see what has been completed and approved. So Tammy is asking, what happens if you're in the middle of writing a positive behavior support plan, but the resident leaves the residential home before it's complete? So that would be a good example, Tammy, of an incomplete event. Let's kind of go back to that one for a second. That would be an incomplete event. So I'm going to talk about how to do that today, and I'm going to talk about how to do that once we've unbundled. Today, adults have professional behavior services bundled into the package of services delivered by the 24-hour provider. That payment is included in the rate category or the tier payment. So in those cases, if the individual leaves in the midst of writing a TESP, in the midst of completing an FBA, or in the midst of completing a positive behavior support plan, then the 24-hour agency would simply include all of that information in the packet of information being moved along when the individual goes into the next placement, because it's currently part of the services provided by the 24-hour provider. However, in the future, when we unbundle professional behavior services from 24-hour services, then you would need to submit an invoice clearly identifying what was able to be completed, document that within the invoice. Sometimes you've got half of it written and you can include that. And sometimes you're just going to have an invoice saying, that you've done interviews and file reviews, but you hadn't actually made it to the point of writing the plan. The invoice should match clearly, the amount invoiced should match clearly with the amount of work being done. And once we've unbundled this service from 24-hour, then you would want to include that invoice with whatever work had been completed to the services coordinator. The services coordinator would request an exception, and once I receive all of that information, again, it's about a 1 week turnaround. So let me know, Tammy, if that answered your question. So I'm going to back up just half a second, remind you that you have 30 hours to budget the TESP, FBA, and PBSP, and 18 hours to budget in maintaining that plan. Now, maintenance of the plan has been a bit of a conundrum for several people. The maintenance of the plan really is exactly that. You are maintaining the positive behavior support plan. Now, that might mean retraining. That might mean you have new staff coming on, and so you need to do more initial training because the staff has turned over. It might mean that the function of the behavior was correct, but the behavior itself is changing. And it might mean that the interventions have exhausted themselves and are no longer working. We're really looking to see clearly in the maintenance section of the plan, how are you maintaining the positive behavior support plan? Your invoice for these 18 hours should very clearly identify everything you're doing and how it connects to maintaining the plan. It is insufficient to simply say, I attended an ISP team meeting. You must say why and how the attendance of that ISP team meeting contributes to maintaining the plan. It is insufficient to say that you spent 3 hours reviewing GERs or IRs. You must include why that is necessary and how it helps you to maintain the plan. It's up to services coordinators and personal agents to read those invoices and to fully understand what all of that is and how it is maintaining the plan, and to ask for clarification from behavior professionals. Any questions on maintenance of the plan? Okay, so the rates in place upon the authorization of the professional behavior services in the individual support plan, remain in effect through the end of the authorized time in Express, and always check the ODDS expenditure guidelines, as that's where you're going to find the most up-to-date rate table. John wants me to remind everybody what happens if you need more than 18 hours to maintain a plan. So in well over 75% of the cases of individuals who reside in an in-home or foster setting, we're seeing that 18 hours is sufficient to maintain the plan. However, in those cases where 18 hours is not sufficient, and oftentimes that is the case with the kids in 24-hour settings, that 18 hours is not sufficient, then we just need you to submit your invoice, the clarification of where those 18 hours had been spent and how it relates to maintaining the plan, submit that to the case manager and ask for an exception. We have about a 1-week turnaround to get exceptions in place once we receive all necessary information. If I don't receive an invoice that clearly identifies where all those 18 hours are and how they maintain the plan, it's going to take longer to get you an answer to the question on additional hours. You're then going to want to request how many more hours do you think it's going to take to maintain this plan for the remainder of the plan year based on the usage prior. Don't wait until you've already used all of your 18 hours. Wait till you're close and then submit your exception. Okay, so back to rates. Remember that you're going to look in the ODDS expenditure guidelines to identify what the current rates are. And rates upon completion of the event, that's when the behavior professional will deliver the TESP, FBA, or PBSP and the invoice. We don't pay a little bit each month when those things are being worked on. We pay for the completion and then we pay the entire invoice for those 3 events because they are event-based services. The behavior professional then is going to go into Express and enter their cost for that document. And this is easy math. You're going to multiply your rate, we'll go through that in a second, by the number of hours being invoiced for the event. The behavior professional enters that cost into Express, and then it can't exceed that which was authorized in the ISP and that which is authorized in Express. It's up to the behavior professional to keep open and honest communication prior to the completion of the event. So in my example with simple math, we said it's going to be 10 hours to complete the TESP, 10 hours to complete the FBA, and 10 hours to complete the PBSP. Well, let's say the behavior professional gets in there, and as they're completing the TESP, they identify 5 more challenging behaviors, and that the designated persons are a little more challenging to work with than previously identified. And so we're going to maybe need more than 10 hours to complete the TESP. It's up to the behavior professional to notify the case manager right away and let them know, hey guys, I don't think 10 hours is going to be sufficient. Let's update the ISP or service agreement and let's change things in Express so that we're all on the same page. That can't be done after the fact. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the current rates. Remember that you're always going to look in the expenditure guidelines to find the most up-to-date rates. Currently, a behavior professional who is traveling less than 70 miles from the individual's home to their office is compensated at a rate of $80 per hour for the entirety, for every single hour, not just for the hours that they are with the individual. And if they travel more than 70 miles, then they're compensated at a rate of $100 per hour. A common question I get is, do they only get that $100 on the times that they are going to visit an individual? The answer to that is no. Because the $100 per hour rate is intended to cover travel, transportation, including things like needing an overnight. So it's $100 per hour if the behavior professional's office is more than 70 miles away from the individual's home. Another question that I really get very commonly is, can a behavior professional invoice for travel time? And the answer is no, that is taken into account in this rate structure. 2 years ago, we were considering adapting the rates to kind of a complicated algorithm that is currently off the table, and for the foreseeable future, that's not going to be in place. Do please make sure that you're always checking the expenditure guidelines to identify the current rate. When a services coordinator or personal agent is going to be approving an invoice, not only do they need to make sure that the document meets rule, but they also need to make sure that the invoice doesn't exceed the authorized amount that's been authorized in ISP or in Express. It is up to the behavior professional to work things out when those hours authorized or the deadline for completing the document is not going to work. An exception is not needed for these things. We know that things need to be kept pretty flexible, and we leave that to the power of the ISP team, the behavior professional, and the services coordinator or personal agent. Invoices should be very, very clear. The Guide to Professional Behavior Services has a couple of examples of invoices. I will tell you right now, these examples are super extra and on purpose so that it highlights a couple of things. So the examples don't need to be exactly replicated, but invoices must include each date of service that's being invoiced. It's not one invoice that says from January to June, I completed a functional behavior assessment. It's got to clearly identify each date of service. It also needs to name the behavior professional or their designee if it's an agency, then name the person who provided that service, which might be several different people if it's an agency. We also want each invoice to identify the location where the service was provided on that date. If the service was delivered using telecommunications technology, we want that identified in the invoice. That's going to be especially exceedingly important during these times when so much of professional behavior services is being delivered through telecommunications technology. We also want to identify the length of time for the service on that date. If a service took less than 15 minutes, we expect that it doesn't get billed for, but it can show up on the invoice. This is a common practice across all CMS billed services. And then we want, of course, a description of the service and to whom the service was delivered. Invoices can include collaboration with a services coordinator, personal agent, or designated persons, or anybody else that's integral to the completion of the event. Invoices must clearly identify how that service provided relates to the creation of the TESP or FBA, or creation or maintenance for the positive behavior support plan. Once the services coordinator or personal agent gets this information, gets the plan, gets the invoice, they must review it and do so in a timely manner. Please, services coordinator and personal agents, do not make the behavior professional beg you for their paycheck. It is essential that if you read it and you realize something is missing, that you maintain that communication and let them know quickly. The number 2 complaint that I get from behavior professionals is that they're spending as much and sometimes more time chasing down a case management entity, wondering why payment has yet to be processed. Please do this in a timely manner. Let's talk a little bit about standard and underserved counties. This has been confusing. So we designated standard and underserved areas. It does not impact the compensation for the behavior professional. It does not impact the rate. When a services coordinator or behavior personal agent identifies that the person resides in an underserved county, they want to identify that with a modifier. Heather's asking if it's acceptable to do the development of a PBSP via video. So yes, Heather, our rule does include the use of telecommunications technology to deliver professional behavior services. If you have questions about that or how that should or could look um, during this time with the virus, please give me a call. Okay, so standard counties are those counties outlined in green, and the underserved counties are those counties in yellow. And you simply are going to add the modifier to your authorization. If the individual lives in a green county, the modifier is ST. If the individual lives in a yellow county, your modifier is RU. Any questions about using modifiers? So we've talked a lot about exceptions. Exceptions happen and are needed, and it's important that I get all of the information necessary so that I can turn that exception memo, letting you know if it was approved or denied, around very, very quickly. So sometimes an individual might need an exception if they have challenging behaviors in multiple settings. Sometimes there's a high volume of change of designated persons, like there's a high turnover rate. Sometimes the individual just experiences some pretty complex behaviors. We often work with individuals with really challenging behaviors, and there's a number of them, and sometimes they're really complex, and it requires much more intensive analysis, planning, and training. Sometimes a language barrier exists and we need an interpreter. So you want to follow the interpreter instructions that I provided at the beginning of this training. And also the use of an interpreter might make the provision of and the delivery of services take a little bit longer. And sometimes if an individual resides in a 24-hour supported living setting, but they also need their plan augmented or updated to include other settings like maybe employment or DSA, then we need to request, currently you'll need to request an exception so that we can provide that service to the individual and allow them more time. So in those cases where an individual needs more than 30 hours to deliver their functional behavior assessment, and positive behavior support plan and or TESP, that would be another time to request an exception. So currently, if the individual resides in a 24-hour setting and also receives services from in another setting, for example, employment or DSA, then the individual should receive choice counseling so that they can choose from amongst all qualified providers to augment their plan. Once that is unbundled, I don't know when that's happening at this point, but once it's unbundled, then the set of services delivered by the 24-hour residential provider will fall under just like everybody else. So things will not change. There will no longer need to be an exception because the behavior professional will be documenting all known areas as part of the development of the plan once things are unbundled. Any questions about exceptions? Okay, just a quick reminder about billing codes. If you're going to be authorizing a TESP, you authorize code OR570 with the appropriate modifier, either ST or RU. The same for a functional behavior assessment. If you're authorizing a functional behavior assessment, you're using code OR570 with either the modifier ST or RU, depending on where the individual resides. If you're authorizing a positive behavior support plan, you're going to use the code OR570 with the appropriate modifier depending on where the individual resides. If you're maintaining that plan as indicated in the positive behavior support plan, then you're authorizing code 310 and the appropriate modifier. Okay, so I'm here to answer any questions. I'm not seeing any right now. If you have, or if you would like to receive a certificate of participation in this webinar, type in this web address into a browser. You'll be asked 3 simple questions. You do need to complete all 3 questions. And then the system will email you a certificate of attendance to your email address. I don't get a copy of these, folks. I don't have a way to maintain or manage them. So you do need to maintain your certificates on your own. Are there any questions about today's training? Okay, I'm going to remain on the line for the next, I don't know, 5-10 minutes to see if anybody else has any questions. And here is my email address. I recognize everybody's name on the training today, so I think you all know how to get a hold of me. But don't hesitate to ask. I am here to help. Thanks for attending. I hope everybody is staying safe, staying sane, and doing the best they can during these times.